Last session we considered the background to the First Crusade and the tragic catastrophe of the People's Crusade, which massacred thousands upon thousands of Jews and Christians across Europe before being utterly destroyed by the Seljuk Turks in Anatolia. That peasant rabble was never what Pope Urban had envisaged sending to the aid of the Byzantine Empire when the Emperor Alexius I Comnenus asked for aid. What he instead had envisioned is what came next, the Prince's Crusade. And this was a totally different kettle of fish. Gone were the Jewish pogroms and ridiculous looting and sacking of Christian kingdoms on the way to Constantinople. Well, nearly entirely gone were the latter of those things, at least in comparison to the People's Crusade. 4 main armies left Europe in August 1096, aiming to meet in Constantinople, though taking different routes. The armies were led by these people: Bohemond of Tarento, Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Saint-Gilles, Robert of Normandy, and he was the eldest son of William the Conqueror, by the way, and Robert the Count of Flanders. Also bringing forces were Hugh of Vermandois and Stephen of Blois, and they actually fled home before the end of the Crusade. Now, as you may have noticed, they all have very French fancy sounding names, and that's because they were all either from France, from Normandy, which was French-speaking at this time, or in the case of Bohemond of Taranto, a Norman, i.e. a French-speaking Norman, in southern Italy, who had had run-ins with the Byzantines before. Now, it's difficult to know exactly how many people were on this Prince's Crusade, but it was probably between 60 to 100,000 people in total. Around 4,500 of them were nobles, and the rest were their men, with about 20% being non-combatants. About 1 in 7 of the soldiers were probably cavalry, heavy Frankish knights in excellent armour and well trained for battle. So we're talking about 5,000 to 8,000 cavalry and 30,000 to 50,000 foot soldiers. Such an immense force was much bigger than the Pope ever expected, and much, much, much bigger than Alexius, the Byzantine Emperor, had ever expected. And to make things more complicated, Alexius had had bad experiences with the failed People's Crusade. But he'd also fought a number of wars, as I mentioned, against Bohemond of Taranto and his father. They'd been called on by the Pope to aid Alexius, but their real motives are shrouded in history. It's not entirely clear what these crusading nobles and princes were really hoping to get out of it. Religion undoubtedly was a significant factor driving these leaders to what they wanted to do. But these were shrewd and powerful nobles, mighty rulers, and eager for more power and might and independence and wealth. Their actions in the following years would indicate that actually a significant factor driving them was not religion, but simply the desire to rule and to reign over their own lands, free from the supervision of other rulers like the Pope or the King of France. Let's not forget that these are the same people who were involved just the generation or two before in conquering England and Sicily and southern Italy and various other changes of territory within France. Now they could do all of that warmongering and more with the blessing of the Pope against a heathen enemy. All of that, those mixed motives, previous conflicts, the problems of the People's Crusade, obviously made Alexius Comnenus rather nervous. He had about 50,000 soldiers armed and ready, if not more, camped outside his capital city of Constantinople. But as I said last time, he was a shrewd and clever man, a great leader, but also a cunning diplomat. He wasn't about to try and lead this crusade himself, but he was going to make them all swear fealty to him and promise to return any territory captured from the Turks back to the Byzantine Empire. Notably, that didn't really include the Holy Land around Jerusalem, just the land in Turkey and around Syria. This, more than anything, likely led to the end result of the crusade being Jerusalem and various other factors. And so, through bribery and diplomacy, you know, things like showing a tour of the imperial palace to some of these crusader lords and, oh, is that my treasury filled to the sky with gold? Would you like some of that if you just bowed the knee and made some promises to me? Vague promises about wealth, no hard facts and assertions. Alexius managed to make all of them swear this oath, except Raymond of Saint-Gelais, who simply promised that he wouldn't do anything against Alexius. And so Alexius, with these agreements in place, shipped them across the Bosporus in early 1097, joined by Peter the Hermit, the idiot behind the People's Crusade, and what was left of that disaster. Also joining them were 2 Byzantine generals and their armies, and their target was the city of Nicaea, the same place that those ecumenical councils happened, the first being, as I'm sure you remember, in 325 AD. Now, by 1097, Nicaea was the capital of the Seljuk Turk Empire, which was led by Kilik Arslan. Now, here comes the part where last time I said that ironically the disaster which was the People's Crusade was actually what led to the victory of the Prince's Crusade. You see, Kilij Arslan, having massacred the peasants of the People's Crusade, didn't really see much of a threat ever coming again over from the west. If that was the fabled crusade the whispers and spies had been speaking to him about, then the west was weaker than he thought. Instead, he would focus his energy and power in consolidating Anatolia and fighting other Turkish Muslim dynasties in central Anatolia, central modern-day Turkey. And so when he heard of another crusading force crossing over, he really wasn't bothered and carried on doing what he was doing. The local forces in the west could deal with that peasant rabble on their own this time. And so, without the Turkish army there, the Crusaders quickly made to Nicaea, unopposed, and subjected it to a siege. When Kilich heard this, he turned around with his army, and he was stunned by the size of the force and roundly defeated in battle when he tried to break the siege of his capital city. Eventually, Nicaea fell to the Byzantines, who secretly negotiated with the Muslim forces and entered the city from behind across a lake and simply declared victory, unfurled their flags, and forbade all the crusaders around the walls from looting the city. Bear in mind that the overwhelming vast majority of the population of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, at this time was Eastern Orthodox Christian. Indeed, it's probably worth pointing out that although it had been in Muslim hands for nearly 400 years at this point, the majority of people around Jerusalem and much of the surrounding area were still Christian, and significant Christian populations remained all across the Holy Land. So, Heading towards the Holy Land, following the capture of Nicaea, the crusading force moved across the deserts of Anatolia, where they faced constant harassment from Turkish horse archers and others, and with it being summer, oppressive heat, water and food running out. Cue the looting and pillaging of the local Christians, something the Byzantines were none too happy about, obviously. Things got worse in Cilicia, at the corner of the Mediterranean, which is where the Armenian kingdom, filled and ruled by Armenians who had fled their homeland following Turkish invasions, resided. In Armenian Cilicia, the Crusaders began to fight each other in their attempts to finally start conquering territory over which they could rule. Baldwin ended up being adopted by the Armenian ruler of Edessa, who then ended up getting killed by a local mob of rioters, and so the first of the Crusader States was established. And interestingly, although Edessa had been Byzantine only 11 years before, Alexius didn't ask for it back. It was simply too far from his main empire for him to really maintain control over. Meanwhile, the rest of the Crusaders had moved down to besiege the city of Antioch, the key city between Constantinople and Jerusalem. Thousands of Crusaders starved to death during the 8-month siege. Stephen of Blois deserted, and on his way back he told the Byzantine emperor, who was bringing an army to help capture Antioch, one of his prime targets for recapture, that the cause was lost and all the Crusaders were dying of starvation and thirst. And so sadly Alexius turned back disheartened. The Crusaders, though, eventually did capture Antioch due to the Christians inside opening the gates. But then they were surrounded themselves by a Muslim force, who were then routed following the miraculous battle which followed the discovery of the Holy Lance that pierced the side of Christ himself. After much, and I do mean much arguing, Bohemond became the first prince of Antioch. It was not given back to the Byzantines, who the Crusaders felt had abandoned them in their hour of need. From Antioch, the remaining Crusaders, not those in Edessa and around Antioch, headed down the coast towards Jerusalem. During this time, a trial by fire led to the death of a key cleric, and the Holy Lance, which had led to the miraculous battle and salvation at Antioch, was declared a fake. In early June, the Crusaders finally set eyes on Jerusalem, and many of them broke down and wept. Jerusalem was held at this time by the Egyptian Fatimids, who had conquered it from the Turks only the year before. Following 3 days of fasting and then walking around the city barefoot in a Jericho-esque display, the Crusaders attacked, conquered, and massacred the population. A day or two of non-stop slaughtering of Muslims and Jews, and not a few Christians. Ultimately, Godfrey of Bouillon was elected as the ruler of the new kingdom of Jerusalem, much to the fury of Raymond, who until that point had largely been seen as the foremost of the Crusaders. He would never get his own kingdom in the Holy Land, but his heirs would capture Tripoli in 1109 and form their own county, while Bohemond would return to Europe and end up attacking the Byzantine Empire from his own lands in southern Italy, and ultimately being defeated. The Principality of Antioch became a Byzantine vassal. The various Crusader states, their kingdoms secured, had variable relationships with each other, like any other Western Christian kingdom. Sometimes they helped each other, sometimes they really did the opposite. Among the Muslim states in the surrounding lands, it's quite difficult to know exactly what they thought was going on at the time, but it doesn't, at least at first, seem to have been seen as a major thing. They'd been fighting each other and fighting the Byzantine Empire for centuries, and these recent events were just seen as the Byzantine Empire hiring a lot of mercenaries to take back their lands from the Turks. Given the massive rivalries within Islam at that time, there was certainly no notion of a united Muslim counterattack against the Christian Crusaders. Let's look at a map of how things ended up. This is the Crusader States at their largest extent in about 1135. The Byzantine Empire in southern Anatolia and Cyprus, the Crusaders came through and started fighting each other in the Principality of Armenian Cilicia. From there, one of them was adopted by the ruler of the county of Edessa, and he took over Edessa and the surrounding area. Then they took Antioch, the key city, and it wasn't given to the Byzantines because the Byzantines had turned back. They headed down the coast and they conquered Jerusalem, and the kingdom of Jerusalem was established, and on the way back they also conquered Tripoli and formed a kingdom there. These are known as the four Crusader States: the county of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, the county of Tripoli, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem. That's how things roughly ended up. These were the Crusader States. Though this is a bit of a misnomer, as most Crusaders actually went home. And though about 15% of the population of the region would end up being French, this was mainly through later immigration of non-Crusaders. In fact, most of the actual Crusaders simply left, except for the top lords and their most faithful soldiers. In addition, the idea of Crusader States sets up a much more than necessary religious antagonism of the events, which actually were not necessarily seen as that significant at the time. Because of this, the term outre-mer, which is French for beyond the sea, is often used for these set of states. But to be honest, I don't like speaking French, and Crusader States sounds much more epic, and so I'm going to stick with that. It's worth remembering as well that these Crusader States were not a short-lived enterprise, but a long-lasting reality, with families having multiple generations of children growing up and dying out there in the Holy Land. The last of the Crusader States didn't fall for 193 years. That's how old the United States of America as an independent country was in 1969, for a bit of perspective. But not all of the kingdoms lasted that long. The first state created, as I said, was the county of Edessa in 1098. It was also the first to fall. Edessa was conquered by a Turkish military leader called Zengi in 1144, and this led to the new pope calling a new crusade, the Second Crusade, which was the first not to be led by people, not to be led by princes, but actually by kings. Although it isn't generally known as the King's Crusade, because that would be too simple. Instead, that would be the Third Crusade we'll get onto another time. These kings who led the Second Crusade were Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany, who, combined with other willing nobles and soldiers, set off across Europe separately to retake the county of Edessa. Key to raising the soldiers for this crusade was a monk of much more significance and clout than Peter the Hermit, and one we mentioned back in session 31 when we considered the expansion of monasticism. That man was Bernard of Clairvaux, who was vital in revitalising, reimagining and greatly expanding the Cistercian order of monks. He was personally commissioned by the Pope to preach for the Crusade, and did so very well. However, as in the First Crusade, some popular preachers began preaching as well, and this led to them inspiring massacres of Jews across Germany. Something that Bernard was so upset by that he travelled there in person to stop it and get the preachers sent back to monasteries to live out the rest of their lives away from the public. Now, to say that the Second Crusade was a disappointment would be an understatement. Both of the armies separately were defeated by the Seljuk Turks in Anatolia, and Western Christians even accused the new Byzantine emperor, Manuel I Comnenus, as someone who was conspiring with the Turks and hindering the crusade. This was almost certainly absolute nonsense. It would serve no purpose for the Byzantine emperor to do harm to these Western Crusaders, but it was something which led to an increasing souring of relations between the West and the East, between the Roman Catholic and the Eastern Orthodox Christendoms and their associated secular spheres as they grew further and further apart. Louis and Conrad eventually did make their way with what was left of their armies, which wasn't a lot, and they arrived in Jerusalem. And following pressure from the King of Jerusalem and the Knights Templar, there's another story perhaps for another time, they decided that rather than retaking Edessa, let's attack Damascus. Let's attack Damascus. For reference, Damascus, Jerusalem is down here, Tripoli, Antioch, Damascus is around here. Now, attacking Damascus, to put it bluntly, was absolutely stupid. Like a level of stupid beyond Peter the Hermit and the People's Crusade. Damascus was the most powerful Muslim state and city in the area, and the Muslims there had time to prepare. They even stopped their military conflicts with other Muslim powers, though those Muslim powers would not help Damascus directly, and so the siege utterly failed. The crusade was a disaster. Distrust between the different factions among the Crusader kingdoms and the different crusading kings, senses of betrayal left, right and centre, led to a weakening of the Crusader States as a whole. Though the Kingdom of Jerusalem actually did manage some expansion into Egypt, it even took the city of Cairo for a time in the 1160s, the hatred towards these Crusader states in Syria due to the unprovoked attack on Damascus, and then in Egypt due to the attacks there, would spell disaster for them, when in 1171 a certain Saladin united Egypt and Damascus as one united empire, thus encircling the Crusader states. In 1187, Jerusalem would fall, and Saladin would reduce the 3 remaining Crusader states to small territories with their remaining key cities. It ended up something like this. All of Jerusalem is lost apart from the city of Tyre. The county of Tripoli is reduced. The principality of Antioch is reduced. Edessa was gone already. That's why you had the Second Crusade. And all of this land into Egypt and beyond is run by Saladin. Not by the Sultanate of Rum, but by Saladin. This obviously required a response. And so began the Third Crusade, the King's Crusade, which we will look at next session along with the Fourth Crusade and other Holy Land based crusades.